So, Susie, I had to take a lot of stuff to the tip over the weekend, still clearing out all the rubbish from the kitchen. And it reminded me, a couple of years ago, I was taking stuff to the tip, and there was a bloke who was throwing away one of those big sit-on toy car things that are like 150 quid. And so I just went, oh, could I have that, mate? And now every time I go to the tip, I'm on the lookout for another great freebie. So it got me thinking, what's the best freebie you've ever had?
I did pull a nice vintage mirror out of a skip, and it now sits in my living room.
Speaking of mirrors, my dad used to have the same mirror from Del Boy's flat in Only Fools and Horses. Not the exact same one from the set, just the same one that looked the same. And I'm hoping, not that I'm wishing anything ill of my dad, but on his passing, that's what I want in the will. I'm not worried about anything else. I want the Only Fools and Horses mirror.
Is your dad's aesthetic Peckham chic?
Not intentionally, but probably, yeah. Hi, I'm David Judel, and betcha by golly wow, I'm here with another Agronomics, your weekly podcast exploring the economics of agriculture. In this episode, I'm back in the company of Susie Stannard, AHDB's lead analyst for not just cream, but all things dairy. We'll be having a chat about the recent Milk Forecasting Forum and pick out some of the main points of conversation. Herd size and milk yields, milk to feed price ratio, availability of replacement heifers. There's plenty for us to look at. If you want to party like it's 1999 each week, then please follow and subscribe to make sure you don't miss an episode. New shows drop Wednesdays at midday, and please get in touch. Don't write a letter, go digital, it's a sign of the times. Then I ask you to comment on any of AHDB's social channels. Or send us an email, agronomics@ahdb.org.uk. We're going to be talking about the Milk Forecasting Forum today, not forecasting whether you use gold top or skimmed on your porridge, but actually talking about milk production. But before we do that, something that caught my eye on the AHDB website recently was an article looking at forecasts for global grain production for 25-26. Because it's quite interesting that on their headlines, these are numbers from the International Grains Council, global grain production is forecast to reach 2.368 billion tonnes. However, there's going to be a lot lower stock carried over into the 25-6 season and an increase in demand, which is saying that stocks aren't really going to be actually increasing that much, even though production is expected up about 63 million tonnes in total grains. Looking at maize, wheat and barley, the stocks are only expected to be up a little bit. And when you dig a little bit deeper, from a wheat market perspective, it's quite interesting that the current projection is for global production for 807 million tonnes, but to be outstripped by demand, 813 million tonnes. And this is the third year in a row that demand has outstripped production, and so stocks are moving lower again, down to about 260, so about 5 million tonnes of global stocks. So it is sort of a steady contraction in the wheat supply. So it'll be interesting as we then go through the spring period and we get into that yield forming, that if people start getting very conscious about it. And speaking of the spring, we have our spring planting and variety survey, which would be opening soon in early April, where we'll be gathering data for the amount of crops that have been planted for the UK, so we can understand exactly what our production expectations are going to be for this harvest. Hopefully better than it was last year. But we're here talking about milk today and welcoming back Susie to the podcast. And we're going to talk about the Milk Forecasting Forum today, Susie. Before we get into the detail, do you want to just explain what that forum is?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We've been running the Milk Forecasting Forum for quite a long time now. I think certainly over a decade, and it's just an opportunity for us to be more forward looking really and looking at what our expectations are for the year ahead. But we don't want to just be in transmit mode. We don't want to just be telling industry what we think is going to happen. So what we do is we get a bunch of stakeholders together, so from unions, farmer representatives, farm business consultants, processors as well. We share a pack of evidence which we walk everybody through, put out where we think milk production is likely to go over the coming year. And then we stress test it really by, having a discussion around the different points. Have we made the right assumptions? Do we think we're being too optimistic or too pessimistic, or are we about bang on? And then post that, then we'll adjust that depending on where the discussions took us. But I think it's a great opportunity really just to take some time outside of what's going on right now to think about the kind of coming year ahead.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's one of those factors where it's about looking forwards, and this isn't about making sort of snap decisions about things, is it? It's very much kind of setting that theme. And we've had a very interesting period for the dairy markets recently, and actually quite a favourable period in terms of production. So I guess what's the vibe of the group going forwards? Do they expect that let's go crazy and it's all going to continue on the production side, or is there winds of change coming?
The discussion was really interesting, actually. We presented a view which I think was probably a little bit more pessimistic than the rest of the group. There were lots of positives that we were taking on board, which we'll run through today, but primarily is that milk prices have been really good, and the feed prices have been much more reasonable than we saw a couple of years ago where we had galloping inflation. So because of that, that's kind of providing an impetus to milk more. However, the reason for our sort of a bit more pessimistic view, we've still got some of those structural issues kind of, burbling along in the background. So, even though feed costs have come down, we've still got things like labour costs really high at the moment and have continued to increase. Interest rates are still very high, so meaning that the cost of borrowing, cost and availability of borrowing has been quite a challenge. And then, things like the announcements about inheritance tax are all environmental regulations are all things that kind of holding that we would have expected to hold farmer sentiment back a little bit. But fundamentally, dairy farmers, they want to milk and they want to make money while they can. And so we went in a bit more of a positive direction. The other thing that we were sort of looking at that did hold us back to some extent is herd size, because that is coming down. And while you can do more with fewer cows and great genetics, increases in genomic use and feeding more and all those kinds of things, better nutrition will allow you to do more with less. With fewer cows, there's always going to be a bit of a ceiling. So all of those factors kind of came into the balance. And overall, we've come out to quite a positive viewpoint, although, within the dairy sector, it can only be 1 or 2% either way. And that can, provide actually quite big effects, even though the figures sound like they're quite small, if that makes sense. So overall, we're forecasting for the 25-26 milk year to end up at 1.2% in growth, which hopefully will come to pass. But forecasting is an art as well as a science. But that's our best guess based on available data at the moment.
And I think you mentioned something in there around the milk to feed price. And I think that's one of my favourite things that we produce is the milk to feed price ratio, because it's taking something that has got so much complexity into it and turning it into such a simple indicator that is just so true and follows through and everything links back to it. So it will definitely be interesting in terms of where the feed price goes, because it feels as if, the milk price, as you say, is kind of everything's favourable at the moment, that there's a risk obviously from a feed price increase, but given where we are at the moment, that doesn't feel like anything's particularly happening anytime soon. So that indicator may remain in a sort of a positive expansion phase for the short term.
Yeah, and one of the great things about being part of AHDB is that we're a multi-sector organisation, and therefore we're able to tap into the best that other sectors have to offer. So we had a piece from Olivia Bonser, who's our senior analyst in the cereals and oilseeds team, who came along to give us a bit of a view on what the outlook might look like for feed prices. And that there's a fair bit of complexity that kind of goes into that, and I think quite a bit of risk in the forecast from that point of view. But I did get her to say, if she was a betting woman, where she thought that things would go, and we're not expecting there to be a kind of sharp increase at the very least. So we were hoping that favourable milk to feed price ratio should stay where it is. And interestingly, it's one of the best ratios that we've seen within the past sort of decade at least. So, that is a positive indication that things should continue to grow.
And we're heading now obviously into the spring flush. And I read something recently that was saying that March, I think we've had recent warm weather and it's relatively mild. It could be the warmest March since 1910. So the weather's been favourable for supporting an early turnout and hopefully sort of forage quality and availability as we go through the season. So is that something where we see kind of a bigger flush through the spring because of all these factors?
Potentially. We're definitely in a very different position to where we were last year. If you cast your minds back this time last year, we were sort of wading through knee-deep water in a lot of places. And, that whole autumn winter season had just been incredibly wet. And that just had the effect of just holding everything back. So grass growth and turnout, all the land got damaged. If you were able to get out, you were poaching things. So that really sort of held the whole season back. This year, things are looking very different. It's been a much drier winter. Temperature-wise, I don't know. Yeah, we've had some nice, warm, mild days. We've also had some very cold nights and some quite sharp frosts in March, which, as things stand, have been holding back grass growth a little bit. So if you look at the Forage for Knowledge service, which AHDB run, that gives you an indication of dry matter through the season. We're considerably back on where we were last year, even though we had difficulties and against the average. And that's just because of these cooler temperatures, really. The good news is because it's dry, cows will be able to get out quite early. What we do need is for some grass to be there for them to eat. So they can eat some of the residual covers, which is great. But what we need now is for a bit of sunshine and a bit more warmth. And then I think the grass will be flying. So yeah, I think that is quite positive for the flush. So we're expecting a really decent flush period. Where there's probably a bit more risk comes in later in the season. That sort of depends on what happens with blue tongue virus. And I think we'll probably come on to that in a bit more detail, but that could be a factor depending on what happens with vaccinations and things like that.
Yeah, well, let's talk about blue tongue, because all these things seem to happen at the same time, don't they? That we're talking about moving into the spring flush, but obviously we're moving into that period in the year as temperatures will become more mild. And I think, those frosts that we've seen probably have helped to sort of slow any potential growth in the movement of midges, the vector of midges, to spread blue tongue. But it is a real risk, and I suppose this isn't just a risk from a dairy perspective. This is a risk across all sectors. But the impact on dairy, it isn't mortality that we see in the sheep, is it? It's more around productivity from a dairy perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's an element of both. It's obviously mortality is nowhere near as severe as we would see in sheep, where it's really quite nasty. But there is an element of mortality that comes through, and then there can be impacts in terms of calves born. So there can be an increase in abortion and just unviable calves being born as well. So there's an element of that. But the biggest factor, probably economically for the dairy sector, is production loss. It's quite tricky getting hold of some of the evidence because there haven't been a huge amount of studies done on it yet. I'm hoping some of those will come through. But if we look at BTV3, which was an earlier variant, the estimates on that were that for an infected cow, you could be losing 1.7 kilograms of milk per day for about 30 days, which annually speaking looks like a loss of about 0.6% production. So if you scale that up, that starts to look quite big. But if you then look at BTV8, which is the current variant, the early signs are that the impacts can be more severe than that. So we could be looking at 8% of loss of production per cow infected, which is quite big. And we've seen a big impact actually when we look at the continent. So if we look at the back end of 2024 in markets like Italy, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, we saw some quite big drop-offs in production. And I think that's definitely playing a role in the dynamics of what's happening in Europe at the moment in terms of milk flows.
Mentioning blue tongue, we've got a huge amount of resource available on our website. We've recently created a vaccination calculator for sheep, and we're looking at cattle and dairy for those as well. And we have got our Battle Blue Tongue campaign, so look out for that. Right, thank you, Susie. I think we'll have a short break there to talk about the latest in the markets elsewhere. And when we come back, we'll be focusing around herd size and declining numbers, as well as talking about sort of bigger, wider geopolitical factors as well.
Hi, I'm Freya Shuttleworth, Senior Analyst at AHDB, with a look at the UK pork market for the week ending the 15th of March. GB pig prices have seen minor increases in the last 2 weeks, with the SPP now standing at 204.2 pence per kilo. EU pig prices have also recorded small uplifts in recent weeks across all key producing nations. However, the price differential between the UK and EU Grade S reference price remains historically large at 49 pence per kilo. Despite this, trade data for January shows that UK pig meat import volumes were down 8% year on year. Disease outbreaks in Europe are likely to have driven some of this volume decline, with the UK banning pig meat imports from Germany, a key supplier to the UK market. Domestic production has continued to strengthen in 2025, with DEFRA data for February up 4% year on year. However, this has not led to an increase in export volume, with all product categories recording declines at the beginning of 2025 compared to 2024. For the latest data and analysis on red meat, dairy and arable markets, head to ahdb.org.uk and click on Markets and Prices.
If you're in the market for another podcast to subscribe to, then look no further than our Manager's Special, AHDB's Food and Farming podcast. Recent episodes include a consumer insight offering on red meat labels and supermarket aisles, as well as a dairy special about our work with retailers to promote milk. If you're after herbs, or rather herbal lays, our shelves are stacked with sage advice on how to introduce lucerne and clover into your fields. In fact, we cater for all tastes, so you'll find sections dedicated to all sectors: pork, cereals and oilseeds, dairy and beef and lamb. And don't forget our middle aisle, where you can often pick up a bargain episode you didn't know you needed to listen to. Search Food and Farming wherever you get your podcasts. AHDB thanks you for your custom.
Welcome back to part 2 of Agonomics. Susie Stannard, our lead analyst for dairy, is with me today. We're not talking about diamonds and pearls or anything like that. We are talking about milk and dairy and what the forecast is for production and the general market conditions. We're going to talk a little bit maybe about Donald Trump, but we'll steer away from controversy there if we can help it. But before we get on to that, Susie, we mentioned in the first half around herd size, and I wanted to ask you about that in a bit more detail from the dairy herd specifically, because on a beef and lamb side, we've done our work looking out for 2030, sort of forecasting herd size and seeing a reduction in herd size for cattle. We know that there's been a greater link between the beef herd and the dairy herd over recent years. So, what's the view for overall herd numbers, and I suppose any risks and factors that we see for that coming up?
I think the pattern overall, according to the BCMS data that we've seen latest, is for herd size to be trending down at the moment. So the latest BCMS data that I think went up to January was for the total herd to be down by minus 0.9% year on year. And we also saw births to dairy dams in the latest quarter also falling to quite a record low as well. And we've also seen a bit of a shift around in the age profile of the herd. So interestingly, if we went back about 3 or 4 years ago, we saw this big bulge in the amount of young stock that was coming through. And that was to do with when we really saw an uptick in the amount of sex semen that was being used. Farmers still had a bit of a concern about fertility rates of the semen. So what was happening was that farmers were tending to overserve sex semen to dairy heifers. So they had a bit of quite a big increase in available heifer replacements that were coming through because of this overserve in sex semen. I think what's happening now is that farmers are more comfortable, the fertility rates are better, and the farmers are more comfortable with using it. So there's a better balance now between choosing your best genetics, which you're going to serve dairy semen to, and your tail end, where you're going to put to beef and support that dairy beef supply chain. So there's this kind of twin dynamic which has been going on. But what that's that's meant is that now we're sort of seeing the pendulum swinging the other way, and we're seeing a bit of a reduction in those young stock numbers. And at the same time, that reduction in young stock numbers is coinciding with these pressures. We already talked about blue tongue, but blue tongue's been rampant on the continent, and where usually if you were looking perhaps for some replacement heifer stock, if you weren't going to breed your own, you might look to get some other genetics, and you might look towards the continent to bring those over. They're just not able to kind of easily source those replacement heifers from the continent at the moment. So that kind of squeezes off that pipeline to some extent as well. So even though milk prices are great, milk to feed price ratio looks good, if you want to decide you want to sort of grow your herd, you might struggle just because of the heifer replacements issue, and what there is out there is pretty expensive. So that does present some difficulties. So all of that says to us that the likelihood is that we will continue to see the herd size contracting as well. And then there are other factors as well. The environmental regulations and things like that don't lend themselves necessarily to herd expansion. There's a lot of other things you need to think about around what you do with slurry and all that kind of stuff. So things to think about, but definitely pointing towards a smaller dairy herd.
It's an interesting one to think about. But let's move from I suppose a domestic focus, and we'll finish by talking about bigger picture stuff, because over the course of the last year, we've spoken a couple of times around dairy markets and milk prices, and we've spoken a lot about the wholesale market and about wholesale products and how they've been supporting, both from a classic supply issue, but also because of logistic challenges, etc., supporting the market. So what does it look like from that sort of bigger continental picture, from that wholesale market perspective for cream, cheese products, etc.? And is that another reason why we're seeing those supportive milk prices, and where do we think it's going to go next?
The markets have been interesting. I think if you're just thinking, UK, and you think of like classic economics, when supply is high, you would expect prices to come down because just to keep things in balance. But we can't just think about the UK. We have to think wider than that, towards Europe and even globally. The European picture has been a bit different in that, even though a lot of positive factors are also, helping European farmers, at the same time, they've been struggling with blue tongue virus, which has been a big issue. They've also been struggling with environmental regulations, which have been quite strict, particularly in markets like the Netherlands, where actually herd size movements to try and reduce that have been quite strong. So all of that has kind of reduce some of the milk supply in Europe. And then there's a bit of risk in there. So a lot of the milk which has been coming through is coming through from markets like Poland. And we've seen outbreaks of foot and mouth disease, which have started to creep quite close to Poland. Slovakia is not a million miles away. And if that did end up in Poland, that could really cut milk supplies coming from over there. But I think because we're not seeing strong milk growth over on mainland Europe, we have been seeing strong growth in Ireland, which has kind of had the sort of opposite effects and some balancing. But all of those dynamics mean that actually the UK is looking quite well placed to supply some of that shortfall in European milk production, and that's helping to support prices. So things have eased off their peak a bit, as you would probably expect, but they haven't been moving as quickly as I would have expected them to. And that's, I think, has been because of the European picture. And fats has really been the big story of the last 12 months, and particularly butter, where stocks have been quite low, and that's kept demand's been good, and that's kept prices really, really high. And that is continuing at the moment. And another thing which is sort of driving some of that is the emergence of tariffs coming online over in the US has meant that there's been a big scramble in the last couple of weeks for butter producers, particularly in Ireland, to send as much stock over to the US as they can before the doors slam down. That's providing a bit of a spur in demand on the butter side of things, which I think will keep prices relatively high.
It all adds up across the whole thing, where we think at the moment, from a dairy perspective, we've been in from a producer perspective, a very good position in recent times with, supportive market, as you said, positive cost base in terms of relatively cheap feed prices. But it does feel as if there's quite a significant amount of external factors that are going to be coming into play over the coming months that's going to be a risk. So I guess that's the thing. Well, I'm going to put you on the spot now, Susie. If you had to say what was the one thing that you would focus on for the next 6 months, what would it be?
If I was a producer, I think right now my biggest assessment of the risk coming down the line is disease risk, and particularly from blue tongue virus. So I think if I was a producer, I think I would be looking into vaccination and to try and mitigate that risk as much as possible. We know it can have a big impact for, say, sheep producers, but, for dairy producers, anything that squeezes the milk supplies is just going to be bad news for producers. So, cost of vaccination is relatively low compared to the value that a dairy cow would bring. So, yeah, get it done, I think.
As we said, there's a load of advice and information on blue tongue on our website, so please do check it out. Susie, thank you for your time. We've had a thorough tour de force of all things dairy there. Before we go, we better say who the musical act was that we were putting song titles in for this week. And it was a good one. We didn't go for any of the obvious ones because it's quite difficult to get When Doves Cry or Little Red Corvette into a conversation about dairy. But it was Prince, which got me thinking, maybe we've been titled as agronomics for too long. Maybe we should go like Prince and just turn into a symbol.